What's going on, guys? Welcome to BSOP, Winter Preparation. I was just priming the crowd here this evening and letting them know that I think this is one of the most under-addressed and non-discussed aspects of bonsai. We're going to dive in really deep into winter preparation, okay? And so, as always, we got Kendall on the mic.
Hello.
We've got the silent but deadly Michael Lime Allen on the audio. We've got Mr. Arthur producing the stream. Mr. Ricardo here. These two guys just got done filming a very monumental event in Oregon's ceramics history this past weekend, and you guys will all be getting a chance to see that on Mirai Live. It's very impressive, and I'm sure it's going to be quite beautiful to see what happened this past weekend. And so I wanted to also take a moment to just thank this team. You know, I have thanked the Bonsai Mirai team a lot, but there are some unsung heroes besides sort of the personalities that you guys see on stage. And Colton Vick is not here tonight. He's our administrative director. If any of you guys reach out to Bonsai Mirai, you know, anybody online, any of you guys in the Portland community, Colton has become sort of the face and the person that is making sure all of us are doing our jobs and doing our jobs well. And so Colton, just wanted to give you a little bit of love tonight. And then Troy is sitting over here. He's joining us. So for those of you who know Troy, you know how amazing he is. For those of you that have never met Troy, you should introduce yourself. And also, Troy is responsible for making sure that Bonsai Mirai, the garden, is constantly functioning, that the trees are continuously healthy, and making sure that all of us don't tamper with the trees too much, right? So, last week we launched the new bonsaimirai.com website, and I really wanted to take a moment just to thank Troy for everything that he does, because he's an unsung hero and somebody for us at Bonsai Mirai that holds our operation together. So Troy, thank you very much, man. Couldn't do it without you, right?
Troy's pomegranate is the featured tree on the homepage right now.
There you go, the pomegranate artisan's cup, yeah. And so without this team, we couldn't do this. So we're proud to be here, and again, we appreciate you guys being here with us, okay? Winter prep, let's do it. All right. So as we talk about all of these different facets of bonsai at BSOP, we've been creating this calendar of approaches, this knowledge, this understanding of what's happening with our trees. Talk to me a little bit about winter preparation. There's a microphone somewhere. We've got it. George Biddle's over there in the corner with the microphone. Winter preparation, you don't need the mic to just throw out ideas. What are the trees doing right now? What are the trees doing right now? Dropping leaves, storing energy. What's that? Setting buds for next year. Vascular tissue, putting on vascular tissue. That's right, and we're starting to get to the tail end of that. Now, what are the indications that we're entering sort of this tail end of preparation for the winter season? What would we see in our trees that are telling us the signs? Yes, we are in fact starting to slow down. How would we see that? Less water. Okay, so we're going to see less water utilization, right? Less H2O movement. What else are we seeing? Obviously, the loss of leaves. What else would we be seeing? Fertilizer is not being decomposed. That's a massive one, right? Fertilizer is no longer not breaking down anymore. Okay? And then another big one, no or little sign of added tissue, whether that be foliage mass. So for example, if we're looking at our evergreens, we're looking at our pines. Obviously our pines are not growing right now. If we're looking at our junipers are not adding elongating tips. They're not adding soft fleshy foliage anymore. This is saying, hey, we've done what we had to do. We're in the process now of accumulating sugars and starches. We're loading those sugars and starches into our vascular system. That's decreasing the temperature at which the water in that vascular system is going to be freezing. We are preparing for dormancy. Once we get past this point where daylight length is decreasing, temperatures are decreasing, and we start going on the up and up, maybe we'll start to let some of that water in, bring those sugars to the tips, and catalyze the production of new foliage next season, okay? But right now, we're in the downward slide, okay? So if we start to look at, in this whole process, winter hardiness as a product of temperature and time. We see winter hardiness in our plants follow a very perfect, beautiful bell curve. Okay? Where we're saying, listen, we may see damage at 28 degrees Fahrenheit at the very beginning of preparation for winter hardiness, okay? And that might be somewhere around October or November, where we're at now. But we'll see by January that for our most hardy species, we could be seeing temperatures and winter hardiness at, say, negative 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and we say, holy cow, you're telling me that this tree continues to metabolize. This tree continues to photosynthesize. This tree continues to increase its sugars and starch content in the vascular system to the point that the temperature at which we see damage actually further increases over the course of that late fall, that early winter, that midwinter, and we hit that pinnacle right at that coldest month of the year, which is January, okay? Now, we will also see that come out of that tolerance. That March, April time frame, and we all know it well because if we move our trees out too soon or we get that late cold snap with all of those fresh new buds on, that's when we see a lot of damage coming back out of that. Now let's talk about this process of this increasing cold tolerance and how we start to look at this with our trees to know whether or not we need to be doing something in addition to what we already do in terms of caring for them on the bench, all right? What is the portion of the tree that is most susceptible to cold damage? Roots. I hear roots. Do I hear anything else? Leaves. New tips, foliage. Okay, all right. So if you were a tree, right, where would you naturally, well, first of all, if you're a tree, would you want to be a big tree or a small tree? Big, right? If you were a tree, right, if I said, Ron, if you were a tree, would you want to be big or small? Which would you choose? So now we want to be big. I'm used to being small, but I'd rather be big, right? So for all of our bonsai trees, the general idea is that they don't want to be small trees. They don't know any different, right? And every single time they grow, they're trying to be as big as they possibly can. Now we continue to put them in a small container. We cut them back, we wire them, we bring them down, it's constant, right? But that tree wants to be big, okay? So when we start to think about that, that tree wants to be big. All of those components that are adding that kind of size above ground are adapted to cold conditions. But a tree that is going to be a big tree is not adapted to the root system, not having that buffer of the environment, of the ground, the earth, and that constant steady temperature that provides the tree. This is where we see the roots becoming highly susceptible to cold damage, okay? And we need to be aware of that the roots are the most susceptible organ in that tree to potential cold damage based on the fact that they're not necessarily meant to be above ground over the winter season, okay? And this is going to play into what we talk about here. Now, if we start to look at, and knowing that, we start to look at, okay, we're going to have temperatures 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Why is 28 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Or what is 28 degrees Fahrenheit in Celsius? -2, -3 degrees Celsius, probably around there, -3 degrees Celsius. Anybody in Europe watching online? Okay. When we start to see temperatures 28 degrees Fahrenheit, -3 degrees Celsius, why is that a big deal? Why is it not 32 degrees? Why is it not 0 degrees? Why 28 degrees? Why -2 degrees? What's that? Water will crystallize at 28 degrees. Now, shouldn't water technically crystallize at 32 degrees? What's that? Depends on what's in the water, right? These dissolved solutes and whatnot. And we also have to think about the fact that water has a high heat retention capacity, okay? So if we have this exterior bark, we've got this material that is protecting the internal vascular system of the tree. That is preventing heat loss as much as anything else in the winter season, right? So if we're preventing heat loss and we have 32 degrees Fahrenheit, how long, if the lowest temperature in that evening is 32 degrees Fahrenheit, going to be pulling heat out of that tree? Not for very long, right? when we start dropping into that 28 degrees Fahrenheit, that minus 2 degrees Celsius, now we have a period of time where we're below 32 degrees, where we potentially, if we're at the peak of this bell curve, right, where we potentially don't have the resources to protect or stop that water from crystallizing inside of the cell. Water crystallizes, it punctures the cell, and all of a sudden we start to see winter damage. Does that make sense? That's where 28 degrees starts to count. Now, if you guys are starting to say, okay, well, I've done everything that you've said, right? We've followed this physiological path over the course of this season via the BSOP streams, the most amazing streams, and the most amazing club on earth, right? And we've all increased our knowledge and we all understand, right? So I haven't overly reduced the foliage mass. I've got a very healthy tree, et cetera, et cetera. What are some of the things that we would be aware of that would encourage us to be protecting our trees, right? If we're starting to experience or have maybe on the horizon a 28 degree Fahrenheit evening or below. What would be things? Wind. Okay, in terms of the tree. This is a tree I need to protect. This is a tree I don't need to protect. What are the differences? Newly repotted tree for sure, right? Newly repotted tree for sure. Small pots, right? Small pots. Now, come back to me on this. Small pots. Why do we need to protect small pots? Because we just said the roots are the organ that is most sensitive to cold damage. We said that if we hit 28 degrees or minus 2 degrees, we've got enough time for the temperature to be removed from the moisture in that cell, crystallize, and cause damage in the most sensitive area. The smaller the pot, the less water, the less residual heat is held, the faster it cools off. Okay? What else? What other situations with our trees would we say this tree needs to be protected? Recently pruned. Awesome. Love it. Recently pruned. And why recently pruned trees? Why does that matter? I did. I'm pumped. You're my man, okay? Recently pruned. What happens when we prune off portions of the foliar mass of the tree? Excellent. Less sugars and starches are produced to decrease that temperature at which that water freezes, okay? So could we also say recently pruned or trees that in general lack foliage mass, right? So if we have a tree that has very little foliage mass on it, is that tree more susceptible? Absolutely, okay? Recently pruned / lacking foliar mass. So maybe you guys say, oh man, I pruned my deciduous trees in the fall before we came and we had that fall preparation, BSOP fundamentals. It didn't have a lot of leaves on it. They've all fallen on. Is that tree susceptible or not? It is susceptible. If you guys think this could be susceptible, that is your bonsai spidey senses. That is your bonsai brain saying, please protect. If in doubt, protect, 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 okay? And we're going to get into methods of protection, but let's talk about one more situation that we should automatically understand, increasing our susceptibility to cold damage. Give me one more. Okay, potentially work done. Type of tree that, dang it. See? Type of tree. So we're talking about species tolerance now, right? Obviously tropicals. Got one right here, redwoods. Something else. Depends on how good we are with the wire, right? Technically, wiring should not decrease cold hardiness. Technically, right? That all depends. What about whether the tree is healthy or not, right? Because when we start to talk about health, what is the epicenter of health in a tree? We've talked about this. I've harped on you guys. I've made you repeat it to me. Balance of water and oxygen. That's right. So when we say lacking health, and we say that health is balance of H2O and O2, which says basically that health is sourced from the root system. Now, if we don't have a good balance of water and oxygen, we're not producing as many roots as we could possibly be producing, which means we're not taking up as much water as we could be taking up, which means we're not delivering as many resources as we could be delivering, which means we're not photosynthesizing as much as we could be photosynthesizing, which means we don't have as many sugars and starches as we could be producing sugars and starches, which means we don't have as much loading as we could be having loading, which means each one of those cells has less sugars and starches than it should have to be cold tolerant, okay? So when we look at a lack of health in our tree, we have to understand that that is a one-to-one direct discussion of the fact that we have not achieved the level of cold tolerance that we could. Why does this matter? Why does this matter? Because as of November, say, 12th to the 15th, on average in the Pacific Northwest, we will have an Arctic cold front, right? 5 out of the past 7 years, it's been November 15th to November 20th. That single week has given us 5 out of the 7 years an Arctic cold front where we've dropped below 28 degrees Fahrenheit. We are getting there. If we're in Canada, if we're in northern portions of Europe, if we're in upstate New York, we are starting to see these events happen, and we have to understand, what are we doing to protect our trees? What trees are protecting, and what is the theory behind protecting them? Right here in winter preparation, we understand trees in small pots, small trees, shohin, medium-sized trees. If we're in a northern portion where we're experiencing an intense cold, we need to be proactively protecting those trees. Anything that's been recently pruned or didn't have foliar mass, we need to be protecting those trees. We don't have the sugar and starch production to be giving us that cold tolerance. If we have a tree that's lacking health, because lacking health means we didn't photosynthesize as well and we didn't produce as many sugars and starches, we need to be protecting that tree. And if we have species that are not tolerant in their native range, right, to cold, then we need to be looking to give them some protection so that they don't suffer an ill fate based on our negligence as their, right, bonsai cultivator. Does that make sense? Yeah? Any questions? Cool. Wait, hang on. You. I knew there was one coming from you.
If all the leaves have fallen off, if you've like cut off,
Gotta talk into it real good.
if you've cut off some of the leaves
There you go.
and then they all fall off,
Yeah.
how do you know that whether it's got how do you know whether it has enough leaves to be cold
That's
tolerant?
a good question. That's a good question. Indication that we have, so for our deciduous trees in particular, and we brought one just to have this discussion with you tonight. With our deciduous trees in particular, how do we know that deciduous trees have achieved any degree of cold tolerance? What would tell you that they've achieved any degree of cold tolerance? There have to be indicators. We can't say, it had leaves, it should be good, right? Okay, strength of the buds, potentially. Change of color, Roger says, change of color. Okay. What's that? Thicker bark. And I think in general, when we see addition of tissue, did we see a wound callus over? Did we see new tissue generated? Did we see branches thicken? Did we see wires start to bite in? What is happening here, anytime we add vascular tissue, this is the tree saying, I am injecting sugars and starches into my system to set up the vascular tissue for next season to be producing more foliar mass. That means that it has allocated the resources towards protecting itself to be able to push that flush next year. That is a direct indication. So, to come back to your question, if we've seen any of those characteristics happening in our deciduous trees, we know that we've accumulated sugars and starches, okay? Now, last time we talked about the fact that we can cut down the photosynthetic surface area on our deciduous trees to get finer and finer ramification, right? You guys remember that with the Zelkova? What was one of the risks or the byproducts of doing that? Decreased winter hardiness, right? And so we know the more and more refined our deciduous trees in particular get, the more careful we've got to be during the winter season because those refined tips are now no longer as winter hardy as the bigger, more lush, thicker structural and vascular components of that tree. Okay? We good? Yes. So when we're at Bonsai Mirai and we see that Arctic cold front coming, which last year didn't come until after Christmas, that was the first for me in the Pacific Northwest, right? But when we see that coming, we all start to freak out. Troy and I start to, do our back stretches and our exercises, right, to get ready to be moving, 600 trees into cold storage, whatever that may look like, okay? But we're automatically turning in species that are not tolerant and the smallest trees first, right? Get the shohin in, get the medium-sized trees in. Those are the ones that are at the most highest degree of susceptibility, okay? Let's talk about protection measures. Kendall, do we have anybody online that's got any questions? Are we doing okay?
We're doing all right.
We're doing okay?
Yes.
Protection measures. So in our weekly Q&As for Tier 3 members, one of the questions we get most is how do we protect our trees during the winter? How do we protect our trees during the winter? And this now starts to become a discussion of severity, right? How cold is it going to get? How cold is it going to get? And how long does it get that cold, right? Because we just said something very significant here. We know sugars and starches decrease the temperature at which that water will crystallize, decreases the freezing temperature, okay? What else did we say about water as a molecule that is very significant for us to keep in mind? Okay, crystallization. Heat retention, right? Water has a very high heat retention capacity. So when we start to talk about severe cold, minus or 28 degrees or below Fahrenheit, minus 2 degrees Celsius or below, right? We also need to be considering the fact, how long is this cold spell going to last? Are we going to be in the 20s for a week? Is the temperature going to rise above 32 degrees Fahrenheit in that span of temperature? Are we going to be in the teens? Is it going to rise above? Are we going to be in single digits? Is it going to rise above? Okay? Now, what's the easiest way that we can provide our trees some buffer from freezing temperatures? Easiest thing that we can do. Put them on the ground. Very good. All right, so number one, easiest, we'll go low impact to high impact. Number one, put trees on ground. Why does this matter, to put your trees on the ground? Why is this significant or important? Ground's warmer. Very good, the ground's warmer. So we're using residual heat from this very consistent heat source, which is the ground. Has anybody ever tested the temperature difference underneath a pot on the ground versus air temperatures outside of that? No? 7 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. 7 to 10 degree difference from just underneath a container to out in the open air. That is scary. That's a scary amount of difference, right? That means that if you're experiencing temperatures in the teens, the root system is experiencing temperatures in the 20s. That is a very, very big tool for us to utilize. We'll bring a mic to you.
I got a question from the live stream.
What do you got?
Mike wants to know if cloth frost covers are a good idea on freezing nights.
Could be. Generally, most cloth frost covers in the nursery industry, we're talking about 3 to 4 degree temperature differentiation. So a lot of times they'll use that for citrus when they're going to freeze. If we're getting much below sort of that 25 degree range, they stop functioning really to stop freezing, but they could be that thing that cuts the cold enough for your trees to survive. Yes, sir.
Would you care to define on the ground? Would the cement slab be as good or not as good? Gravel bed as opposed to dirt?
Sure. Yeah, great question. On the ground, what does that mean? So we're going to be saying in contact with the heat productive portion of the ground. That could be on gravel. That still is on the ground. That could be on mulch. That is on the ground. That could be on grass. That is on the ground. That could be on raw dirt. That is on the ground. Concrete tends to be sacrificing heat very quickly and doesn't have the same characteristics as the ground itself. Okay? All right?
Frank's got a question.
What do we got, Frank?
Frank has some nursery stock trees that are wrapped in burlap
Uh-huh.
and is wondering, they were just purchased, would planting them in the ground until spring be the best option?
Yeah, so let's keep going here, Frank, and we're going to answer that question. So, say for example, winter of 2013 to 2014. Does anybody remember that winter at all in here? This is what Bonsai does to you. It contorts your mind, right? Because all of a sudden you remember things that nobody else cares about, but they matter greatly to you. Okay, I don't know what your guys' temperatures in Portland hit. We hit 2 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Which is, so what, 2 degrees Fahrenheit minus 15, 18 degrees Celsius, maybe a little more. Okay, so we hit 2 degrees Fahrenheit. We did not get above 24 degrees for 4 days, right? So we were extremely cold at Bonsai Mirai. Now there was another thing that was happening. We didn't have snow, right? We also had wind. And this was the first time in my bonsai life that I thought, I am officially going to lose all of my trees to cold, right? Because they were just simply sitting on the ground. Now, if I wanted to give my trees more of an insurance policy in that moment with that kind of cold, what could I have done? Next level of investment, but still low pressure in terms of what we would have to do. What could I have done to protect them? Spray them with water. Maybe, right? So we could say heal them in, right? Or put mulch, straw, leaves, blankets around the pots while on the ground. Okay, because now we're saying, listen, we said there's a 7 to 10 degree difference underneath the container versus outside of the container when it's on the ground. We're not going to be getting temperatures above freezing, and in fact, we're going to be so far below freezing that we're going to be pulling all of the heat out of those roots very, very quickly, and it's not going to be able to replenish. So now we're testing the tree's durability. How much can you take? And they're sitting there going, oh, I'm cold, I'm cold, I'm cold. And it's like, you got a couple more days of this, like, can you take it? Can you take it? Can you take it? And then the wind's like, shh, and there's no snow insulating that. This was a true testament of whether a tree was healthy or not. So in the Willamette Valley, they estimated losses in excess of 40% of nursery stock at most of the container-grown nurseries in the Willamette Valley that winter, right? Just a little caveat, little star. When do you think they saw the death of those trees the following season? Spring? May, June, right? Now, why May, June? That doesn't make any sense. They died. They don't have roots, right? They had stored resources. That's right. So they had these stored resources. Those stored resources produced that foliage mass. That foliage mass had its first hot day, demanded those roots, supply that moisture. No roots left. Right? And I was shocked as I was seeing, I thought, I'm through it. March, April, doing great. Juniper's looking good. Everything's good. 2 degrees isn't anything, right? And then May hit, and we hit that first 85-degree day, and all of a sudden they started looking kind of brown and a little yellow, and then they just, right? And we lost 24 trees that year, right? Each one of them had some health-related issue. Every single one of them had a health-related issue. This is what created this whole body of knowledge, okay? All right, so we can put them on the ground. We have temperatures in excess of this, right? So even in Minnesota, there's a lot of students in Minnesota, Bonsai Mirai students, Mirai Live students, and they've started recognizing that putting their trees in a dark shelter over the course of the wintertime actually is maybe potentially preventing that arc, that bell curve of increased cold tolerance from occurring because the tree can't photosynthesize to continue creating those sugars and starches, right? And so some of them have been leaving their most cold hardy species, ponderosa pines, Rocky Mountain junipers, out in the Minnesota weather, but they heal them in, right? On the ground, healed in, and they're finding that their trees are doing better the following season. Stronger growth, more quality growth, better back budding, etc., right? Very interesting that we start to see this happen, okay? Mike.
Can you go over what you just said about the dark? I missed the connection there with healing in.
Great, great. Okay, so let's come back to this. So we drew, right, this perfect, and I'm going to leave this bell curve here, which is temperature, tolerance, and time. And we're saying that trees actually become more tolerant, negative 10 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 degrees Fahrenheit, January, April, October. We see trees become more cold tolerant over the course of winter. And we say, how does a tree become more cold tolerant? It has to be increasing its sugar and starch content in the cell to be gaining cold tolerance or decreasing the temperature at which the water in any individual cell freezes, okay? But if you can't produce sugars or starches, which are the product of photosynthesis, if you can't produce those because you're being stored in a dark environment, how do you continue to add to that cold tolerance over the course of winter? This is the question. And we all think 32 degrees or below and the tree's not metabolizing, right? 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 But we should all know that that's not the case. Right? That's not how this works. Roger, you got a question? Deciduous trees. Hang on just a sec. George, you want to hand that to him?
I understand in the winter where conifers and such will continue to photosynthesize. Are you saying that the deciduous trees also continue to photosynthesize during that period?
Good question, right? How do deciduous trees differ from conifers? And that would be an exception because this deciduous tree has this extremely robust surface area, much larger when we compare it to a conifer, right, of their leaves. Much larger photosynthetic surface area, much thinner, right? So that means we're losing more water, we're moving more water, okay? And also, when we start to look at this, right, the cuticle, very thin compared to the waxy, hard foliage of a conifer. So we're transpiring, we're moving, we're accumulating far more. A deciduous tree definitively continues increasing its cold tolerance over the course of winter, but not via the mechanism of photosynthesis, via the reabsorption of the pigments that exist in the leaves, which is why we see the color change and why we can be pruning our deciduous trees at the end of fall and still having those cuts heal before they go into total dormancy. Okay, so the bell curve would look a little bit different, right? It would be a little bit more skewed to where you would see deciduous trees maybe looking like this. Okay? Very, very interesting, great question. Okay?
Some folks online were curious, how thick should the layer of either leaves or blankets be?
Great question.
And should it go over the edge of the pot?
Great question, right? This is all the stuff that we've got to dig into tonight, okay? So when we start to create these beds, or we heal these in with mulch or leaves, or we wrap blankets around them, one thing that we want to keep in mind is the more that we apply material around this tree, the less airflow is occurring through the root system itself. And that's okay. That's okay when metabolism slows down to have less airflow. If it wasn't okay in the Pacific Northwest or most portions of the country where we have a lot of moisture, trees would die of root rot in the winter, and that does not happen. Have you guys noticed that? We get hammered with rain in the Pacific Northwest, yet our trees don't die. Even trees from the Rocky Mountains don't die. That's an anomaly, right? Even trees from the Mojave Desert don't die. But I thought they were desert trees. They shouldn't be able to tolerate that much moisture. Well, temperature is a big part of that, okay? We want to be able to maintain a clear surface of soil to allow oxygen to still be moving through our soil column, okay? But the more that we cut down on all of this area around the container, the more we decrease airflow around that area of the container, the more heat we keep inside of that container, and the lower the temperature that tree can withstand, because we know the roots are the most sensitive organ on that tree to cold damage. Does that make sense? Yeah? Now, where does that start to become, where do we start to have to change our thought process on that? Because we could just say, well, we'll just heal them into the ground, right? And that would be the most effective. What would happen in the Pacific Northwest if we healed our trees into solid clay? We would officially drown, right? We would have no oxygen movement, and we would have anaerobic activity that would kill the tree. So we got to be careful, right? That's where we cut that off. So the gentleman that asked, should I bury these in the ground? I would say that the better solution would be to heal with bark, dust, mulch, leaves, blankets, heal those trees in, but not down into the ground, so that you maintain oxygen flow while decreasing the amount of temperature loss from the root mass. We good there? We got a question?
Yeah, I'm still looking confused about the whole thing about putting trees in darkness and that. For like junipers and pines, how much shade could they have in the wintertime and still be okay here in the Pacific Northwest where we're not getting that cold?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, has anybody in the room ever done an experiment where you have in fact cut off sunlight to your trees over the winter season while you've also had trees that have experienced sunlight over the winter season? Has anybody done that experiment? So at Bonsai Mirai, all of our benches run east to west. And that's a very strategic orientation of our benches, because that means that the front of the tree either faces south or north, right? So that we get a full blast on the back and front of the tree. This is how you maximize, particularly for weaker branches, exposure to south in the northern hemisphere, in the southern hemisphere, exposure to the north, okay? But in doing so, if you take your trees off and you set them on the ground on the north side of a bench, they exist in shade for the majority of the winter season. And so for the first 3 years, I didn't think anything of that, because I thought they're dormant, right? They're not, it's cold, it's winter time, they're not doing. And what I found is the following spring, the trees on the north side of the bench were far weaker, far less productive, had far less vigorous growth, had far less ramification development, had far less backbudding. All of the things we want suffered from not having that sunlight over the growing season. And so when we say, listen, we can put them in the shade, it is true, they will not die, right? But what we get from them the following season could be impaired, because if it's 32 degrees or above and they're metabolizing, right, they're using stored resources as opposed to photosynthesizing and producing stored resources. And that's where we've got to make that delineation, right? That's right. They are using resources, not producing resources. Hang on.
You're confusing me between the conifers and the deciduous.
Sure.
It's
Sure.
my understanding that deciduous can put
Agreed.
in the garage.
Agreed. You are correct. Deciduous can go into dark, right? But even, I will tell you this, even with deciduous trees, there are studies out there that show notably better growth the year after they were given sunlight as opposed to being kept in the dark. There are numerous horticultural studies that show that it does in fact. Photoperiod is a major trigger for all metabolic processes in plants, whether they have a photosensor or not, because we're still exchanging water, resources, transpiration through the bark, through the trunk, through this mass that doesn't have any leaves. And so if we think that just because we lose this singular organ, well, look at all of the other things that compose this tree, right? Just because this is gone doesn't mean that everything stops. Things continue to happen. So be careful with that. Now, can they tolerate it? Yes. Better than conifers? Absolutely. Is sunlight always important to a tree? Without a doubt. Without a doubt. No matter the season. Sure. Okay?
Michael wants to know how water moves in deciduous trees if they don't have foliage in the winter.
Sure. And again, right, deciduous trees, one of the biggest characteristics of deciduous trees that makes our life as bonsai stylists so difficult is what? As a stylist, right? I'm going to come in here, I'm going to wire this tree. Okay, brittle maybe. Thin bark, very good. Thin bark, right? And when we start talking about bark, right, thin bark, and we say, oh my gosh, we damaged it. Oh my gosh, I have a wire scar. Now I'm going to see that for the rest of this tree's life, okay? But when we start thinking about thin bark, the other thing we have to think about is there's less protection to prevent moisture loss out of this tree, right? Water is freely being exchanged in and out of this trunk as we're speaking right here, right now, right? This tree is giving off, it's transpiring water, right? Via the branches, via the buds, via the trunk. They are all losing water. And the thinner the bark, the more water is being lost. So we have to understand that when we start dealing with deciduous trees, that loss is occurring during the winter season for these, right? And it continues the metabolic process that allows this tree to adapt to that. Without having this draw, it still has this draw, and that's why a deciduous tree will continue to dry out over the winter season, without a doubt, right? Okay? I hope I'm not breaking your guys' brain too much, okay? I don't want to devastate you guys too much, but understand these things. What do we got?
Would it be a good idea then in the winter, if you know the transpiration is happening, to mist it, the fine branches?
Ooh, I've never thought about that, actually. I don't know. But that would be, so when you guys have these ideas, and I encourage you guys constantly, when you have that idea, there's only one way to know the answer to that. You got to try it, right? Have one that you do it on, have one that you don't. See if there's a difference. Consistently try that, right? Yes?
Brian, how about a tree that's not really deciduous or a conifer? I killed a couple honeysuckles.
Killed a couple of honeysuckles. Because of cold?
Yes.
I
was afraid to put them in total darkness. I didn't have a greenhouse. And I tried keeping the pots warm and all that. Didn't work.
So it seems to me like maybe cold tolerance issues for that. Sounds to me like it's an evergreen honeysuckle?
Yes.
Okay, because some honeysuckles are deciduous. Yeah.
Evergreen.
Okay, right. Then it sounds to me like we got to find a better wintering quarters for those trees. But I would also go through the checklist, right? How cold did it get? Were the roots susceptible? Was it in a high state of susceptibility at the beginning or end of that, where its cold tolerance was very, very low, right? When did that damage happen? When could it have happened, and what could you have done to prevent it? Just because a tree dies doesn't mean necessarily it's not cold tolerant, right? So we've got to rule out all of those other factors. Sound good?
Got a couple.
Let's do it. Impromptu Q&A.
Yeah.
All right.
Winter.
All right. Winter. This is good.
Everyone wants to protect their trees.
Digging in. Have you guys ever had this discussion before? Sweetness. All right, let's do it.
So Donald and Raphael want to know about snow-covered ground. How does that compare to leaves and mulch? And does the temperature under the snow stay at 32 degrees?
That's a good question. Snow-covered ground, how does it compare to leaves and mulch? So typically when we see snow-covered ground, if the temperature has already dropped below 32 degrees and you don't have snow cover, then you've already lost the heat that would be insulating and keeping in. But snow will prevent, or at least reduce the amount of heat lost after the snow has fallen. Does that provide a better cover than leaves or mulch? Absolutely not, because the leaves and mulch would be going on when we have a higher temperature, so that loss of heat would happen far more slowly than when we get snow. Is the temperature under snow always 32 degrees? I think definitely not, because it is a direct correlation to the air temperature when the snow is falling and in terms of how warm or cold that air is around the tree or what temperature that's decreased before the snow accumulates. Okay? Got another one?
Yeah.
All right.
Does putting trees on the ground in the grass make them more susceptible to grubs or sort of root insects?
Yes, absolutely, because you're creating a direct entry point. And here's one of the things we also need to talk about with putting trees on the ground. Does putting trees on the ground make your trees more susceptible to pathogens? What is the biggest pathogen we need to be aware of in the Pacific Northwest impacting the roots of our trees? Phytophthora. Phytophthora. What's the other one? Phytophthora and Pythium. Pythium, right? The two root rot organisms that are the bane of our existence in the Pacific Northwest, right? Now, here's the thing. Here's the thing about Pythium. Here's the thing about Phytophthora. These move via the splash of water, right? They exist natively in the soil, okay? But they cannot enter your root system unless you have an area that is damaged. They cannot enter a healthy root. They can only enter a root that is damaged, okay? Keep that in mind, all right? Al, did you have a question? Hang on just a sec. You got the mic.
So do you have to pre-treat the ground with antifungals?
There's no way to stop it. It exists organically. And so for the grubs and whatnot, if that is a concern, just having a layer of bark or a layer of mulch or gravel will stop a lot of that from happening. But if you set them directly on soil where there are already grubs present, then that becomes an issue because it's an immediate entry point. Okay? What do you got?
So we've talked a lot about trees that lose their leaves as well as conifers, but we haven't talked much about azaleas and other broadleaf evergreens.
Sure.
And what do we need to know about those?
Sure. Yeah, great. Very, very good question, right? So with broadleaf evergreens, now, if I just ask you guys, hey, quick rundown. We got a deciduous tree, leaves are super thin. We got a conifer, leaves are super thick and firm. What are the leaves of a broadleaf evergreen like? Kind of in the middle, right? They're kind of thicker, they're kind of sharper, they're kind of harder, they're not that hard, they're not that soft, they're not that thick, they're not that thin. Are they cold tolerant or not? This is interesting, right? This is interesting. Now, come back to me. Come back to the knowledge. Answer this for yourselves, okay? What is the organ that is most susceptible to cold damage? The roots. How do we know if roots are cold tolerant or not? Just in terms of a species that exists in an area that experiences freezing temperatures, how do we know if the roots are susceptible to cold or not? Just an immediate indicator. Okay, zone which is native, Alan says. This is interesting, isn't it? So in 2013, 2014, we hit 2 degrees. We don't get above 24 degrees for 5 days, right? The only species of tree that I lost was junipers. I didn't lose a single pine. This is interesting, right? Now, I tell you guys this concept all the time. Strength in junipers comes from the foliage. Strength in pines comes from the roots. Where does that body of knowledge come from? Are the roots of pines fine or coarse? Good. Are the roots of junipers fine or coarse? Excellent. Are the roots of azaleas fine or coarse? Very good. Are the roots of, say, Elaeagnus fine or coarse? Coarse. Very good. So if I'm looking at an azalea and I'm saying, is this going to be cold tolerant? The organ that is most sensitive is super duper hairy fine. Where does it store its sugars and starches? It doesn't. It stores them in the trunk. It stores them in the branches. This is why when they're dug out of the field, they can be completely chopped, cut back to virtually no root. And at that moment in time, all those stored resources produce a new root system and make it a great bonsai. But after that point, you do not have the same cold tolerance as you did when it was in the ground, right? Same thing exists. So we have these indicators, we have these keys to bonsai knowledge that are constantly being presented to us as bonsai practitioners. Do you know that they tracked the epicenter of auxin production down to the cellular genetic DNA that produces auxin? Do you guys know what auxin is? Auxin is the thing that gets up into the apical bud and causes it to elongate, and that's what creates big trees. We all said we wanted to be a big tree. That is, we need auxin, right? The reason that they were able to track it is because of bonsai. Now, this was an article about horticulture. This was an article about botany in particular. And bonsai is what catalyzed that knowledge because we handle the roots. We have more knowledge about the root system than any other nursery, botany, or horticultural endeavor because of how closely we handle these roots. And you guys now, right, online, you guys in person, you're learning how to read your trees and their susceptibility to one of the most precarious situations, which is cold. How much do we need to be concerned? What is most sensitive, and how do we protect it? All right, let's keep going. Okay? So right now we're placing on the ground, and we're healing in. Let's talk structures. Let's talk structures. Now we're kind of climbing in impact, we're climbing in control, okay? So let's talk about a cold shelter first. Cold shelter. What do you guys know about a cold shelter? What's up, Greg? Greenhouse. Oh, okay. All right, well, should we just go there? Let's just go there. All right, we'll just go there. Let's just talk about greenhouses. Okay. What do we need to know about greenhouses? I'm gonna buy a greenhouse, or I'm gonna build a greenhouse, or I have a greenhouse, right? This should protect my trees, right? Oh, heated versus unheated, right? What material? How many layers of that material, right? Is there an insulation factor? How high is the ceiling? Why does that matter? Where does the ventilation occur from, right? This is now the world of greenhouses, and you realize that there's a profession, greenhouse management, right, that hinges on all of these things being known. We're not going to go into all of that tonight in depth, but let's just touch on a few things, okay? A few staples of greenhouses. Number one, right? Higher the roof, the slower the temperature shift. Okay, now this is important because a lot of people say, okay, I'm gonna get a hobby greenhouse, right? I got this thing, it's got plastic that goes over the top of it, I'm gonna stick my trees in. There's a very small airspace, right? You will watch that oscillate from single digits to 70 degrees just based on whether the sun is touching it or not in a cold weather environment, okay? Because the airspace is so small. Now, why does the airspace matter in terms of buffering of temperature exchange? Why does that matter? Very good. Not even similar to water. It is water. Air holds water, right? The more water that's in the air, the slower the temperature shift that occurs. Now, inside of an enclosed environment, it makes sense that the air would be holding more water. It makes sense that the transition of temperature would be slower, okay? How do we further slow down the temperature transition? Okay, maybe ventilation. We'll come back to that. Talk to me more about what you were talking about, materials, multiple layers. What does that do? Insulate, right? More layers equals more insulation. Okay? And in particular, what is an insulator? Because what else is important do we say over the dormant season? Trees continue to photosynthesize. What do they need? Light. Very good. The more layers we add, the less light we have. Very good. So now we've got this conundrum because we're saying, oh my gosh, if it continues to photosynthesize, it's going to accumulate sugars and starches. I'm going to have this better product next year. It's going to be more cold tolerant anyways. Maybe I need to heat. Maybe I don't need to heat. How do I slow down the temperature exchange so I could not heat and still have a greenhouse that protects? We add another layer, and that layer needs to have air because air holds moisture, and moisture has a high heat retention capacity. You guys dig? You following me? Okay. So when we start looking at greenhouses, back in Japan with Mr. Kimura, always the do-it-yourselfer Mr. Kimura was, he had a big big peak roof greenhouse, okay? Massive. But in the inside, what nobody ever saw is we had a sheet of plastic that basically created one ginormous airspace in the entire roof of that virtually shut down temperature exchange, right? So when you had howling winds, you had snow falling, you had howling winds blowing across here, it was removing the heat from the air inside of this space, but it was not removing heat as fast from the air inside this space, okay? Plastic ceiling, that's right. If you guys want to increase the efficiency of your makeshift structures, create 2 roofs and give yourself an airspace that buffers temperature fluctuation. If you want to increase the efficiency of your cold structure, use something with a very high roof, okay? If you want to increase efficiency of your structure, right, use multiple layers or components that have airspace built in, period. This is how you overwinter trees very efficiently with light transmission and low heat loss, okay? And this is fundamental greenhouse knowledge. You can Google it. R value of greenhouse materials, it'll tell you all of the numbers that you need to know, okay? Does that make sense? Okay, let's talk about that ventilation thing, all right? One of the issues that we encounter in greenhouse cultivation is what? Okay, potentially disease, that's a good one, right? Disease, what else? Okay, air circulation, humidity, all of these things coming down to the same thing, or too hot of temperatures, right? So we're talking about a greenhouse that keeps things warm, but do we really want it that warm? Right? Most of the time, no, because we don't want trees growing in a greenhouse. What happens when trees grow in a greenhouse? They get weak, the growth is very fleshy, right? It doesn't get woody, it doesn't lignify, longer internodes, bigger leaves because the light level is lower, right? So we don't want to be catalyzing that. How do we keep it cool? How do we keep it cool? Okay, we ventilate. Now, this seems easy, right? I'm going to put a fan on in here, and it should be good to go, correct? If only, right? Strategic ventilation of greenhouses is imperative. If you guys have a greenhouse, where would you want the ventilation to be occurring in this greenhouse? Top of the greenhouse, right? Right here, at the point where we can remove the most amount of heat. Let's ventilate that portion where the heat is, okay? Now, if you're going to have fans blowing here, adding to ventilation, does opening this door improve or decrease the effectiveness of your ventilation? Technically, it decreases it because you stop moving air across the peak and you start moving air across the lower portion. Heat's still accumulating. Having airflow doesn't necessarily mean that we're solving the problem, okay? Greenhouse dynamics and ventilation are a very important thing to research and study before you guys ever construct something to hold plant material, right? I'm going to leave it at that. We good? Okay? Why would we have a greenhouse? Why? Okay, so he said control the amount of moisture that touches your trees. That's a really beautiful point. I like that a lot. Why? If we're able to protect our trees, then we can. Hang on. You're going to talk enough that you need the mic.
If we can offer our trees winter protection, then that increases the amount of work that we can do in the fall and in the spring for repotting.
Nice. Very good.
Extends our season of work.
Very good. So we just said, prior to the greenhouse discussion, you brought this up. You said if you've pruned off a lot of branches, you need to protect it, right? So then what is the cutoff to being able to do bonsai work? Well, we need enough time to accumulate sugars and starches that give us winter hardiness. A greenhouse extends our bonsai capacity, right? If we know that, now all of a sudden we've given ourselves a greater opportunity to pursue bonsai. Is a greenhouse imperative? No. Does it add to your bonsai practice? Yes. I'll leave it at that. Any other questions about cold storage, greenhouses, all of that stuff? We got some, Kendall?
Yeah, Donald wants to know if the double roof prevents the introduction of solar heat.
It slows down the heating up. It slows down the cooling down. It is a buffer.
And then a couple people want to know if they have a hoop house, can they make it higher?
Sure, bigger hoops. Bigger hoops.
Easy.
Absolutely. George, you got one there, and then we got one here.
So if you had a greenhouse, would you not have to do this healing in process of your trees? You could just move them into the greenhouse?
That is exactly it. If you have a greenhouse, all of a sudden that temperature that's going to be damaging to the root zone, you can control that now. Then that's the whole idea.
But in an extended freeze situation, it's with overcast skies, it's entirely conceivable that that greenhouse temperature will fall to match the exterior temperature. Is it not? It's not an assurance.
Could. Definitely could, which is all of a sudden now you say, do you need a heater or not?
Heater
right?
was my next question.
Absolutely. And so if you're saying, listen, I don't want to heat it, but I just want to cut down on the severity of the climatic conditions, that becomes a cold shelter, right? When we start to say greenhouse, now we're controlling the actual physical temperature. Now let me ask you guys this. Okay, we'll get yours and then we'll come back. What do you got?
Would it be a good idea to put a humidifier inside of a greenhouse?
A humidifier, I love this. This is so good. Okay, hang on just a sec. Temperature at which growth is metabolic activity starts to hit a point where we're catalyzing either potential for root growth, potential for vascular growth, or potential for foliar growth. What is it? 42. We're going to say 42. Basically what that means is if you're seeing 38 degrees Fahrenheit as ambient air temperature and you have light, you're probably starting to get there, okay? Do we need a humidifier in there? What is the best humidifier in a greenhouse? Transpiration of moisture through the plant material. The more plants you have in a greenhouse, the higher the humidity will be. So what that tells you in the spring as you're moving all your trees out, as you're getting these warmer and warmer temperatures, you don't want to move too many out and leave only a few behind because you'll create a desert in your greenhouse, right? So there's a very strategic movement of material to maintain the green mass that gives you humidity to a point where plants are still finding the condition favorable. And that's a really important thing to understand, okay?
Is there a way that you can tell that the damage you have on your tree is from cold?
Is there a way to tell that the damage is from cold? Yeah. Yes, generally, yes. Are you asking what that is? Well, we know, right, if we're talking about what is an indication of cold damage, right? We would see immediate necrotic tissue in the finest twigs of our tree, right? So you'd see blackening, you'd see death of the finest twigs. No, you would see it very soon after cold damage occurs because you've ruptured that cell. You would see that start to happen within a few weeks, okay? Now, obviously, if we get into that point in the year, in the spring, where we've produced new growth, there's a demand on the root system to supply water to a transpiring foliar mass, and the foliar mass starts to fail. Generally, that is an indication that we have root-related damage, right? And so that would be another one, although that's a prolonged or a delayed response to that, right? But that loss of viability in the twigs and the tissue that are most susceptible and least filled with sugars and starches, you will see that fairly soon after the cold damage occurs, and that would be an immediate indication. Severe event, loss of fine twigging, that is cold damage.
So Chris says in an area like Denver where we get big swings in temperature,
right,
is it best to unheal trees when the temperatures are up?
No, quite the opposite, because healing your tree in protects it from getting too cold, protects it from getting too warm, right? And this is this whole idea of this insulation factor. Insulation works on both sides, right? I'm warm and I'm getting colder. The more insulated it is, the slower that temperature decreases. I'm cold, I'm getting warmer. The more insulated that is, the slower that temperature increases. So that healing in works both ways towards moderating the temperature fluctuation. And if you guys want to talk about success in overwintering your trees, decrease the rate that your temperature changes. If you can decrease that, the tree has the time and capacity to adjust. That is one of the biggest pieces of successfully overwintering your trees. Decrease the rate that the temperature changes. This is why that airspace is so important.
And then just to follow up, are coarse roots more tolerant?
Coarse roots have more sugars and starches. They're storage organs. They are more tolerant. Fine roots, less storage organ, less tolerant.
And then another follow-up, do we start putting our trees on the ground at Mirai around 40 degrees?
No. We wait until we
Fahrenheit?
see that first event that's going to be 28 degrees or below,
Okay.
and then we do it. Reluctantly do it, right?
All right, you can go.
Okay, here we go. All right, so clearly this is a subject that we need to spend more time on, right? Just to open it up and have everybody be like, wait, what? Tells me that, we need to spend more time on this. We're not going to do it tonight, right? You guys have good information, okay? Is the species tolerant? Do you have the soil mass? Do you have the health? And do you have the foliage mass? These are all the things that are telling you, do we need to be concerned or not, okay? That's important to understand. There are multiple ways we can protect. On the ground is the least impact, right? We can heal them in. This gives us more protection. We can put them in a shelter, and now we understand that the airspace, the size of the shelter, the height, right? The layer, the material, the ventilation, all of these things are changing the way that that behaves and the way that that takes care of the tree. Are we good there? We feel pretty good about that. Cool. So what I wanted to come back to is now tapering into this point where we know if we're taking away foliage mass from trees, we're increasing their susceptibility to winter damage. What do we do as a bonsai practice at this time of year? Okay? And this is where I wanted to come back to the Redwood. Who all is a Mirai Live member? You guys all should raise your hands even if you're not. Otherwise, no, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Okay, we did this Redwood last week. And we pruned this first kind of round of bottom branches. And I wanted to bring this back and show the finished product because as we move into the dormant portion of the year for a lot of our temperate trees, our deciduous trees, we're going to do a little bit of work on the deciduous, not a lot. We're going to talk about that, okay? On our conifers, we don't want to be reducing if we're going to winter these outside because we're decreasing their cold tolerance. But these species that don't necessarily have the ability to tolerate outdoor conditions, this is when they start to become fun because we're like, oh, I can still bonsai these, right? Redwoods are not necessarily predictably tolerant of freezing conditions, okay? So we proactively overwinter all of our redwoods in a greenhouse. And it just so happens when we start dealing with Mediterranean varieties of trees, Mediterranean climates are used to a very dry summer. They start getting fall rains and rain through the winter, and then in the spring they dry out again and go through an extremely dry summer. These trees start putting on potential buds and metabolism once fall rains begin, okay? So this tree was pruned very heavily, selectively back to buds that already existed, finer ramification, etc. I just wanted to bring this tonight to show the product of what a well-pruned redwood moving into the evolution of a refinement phase where we're utilizing that setup of that growth to be the indicator that it's starting to actually move into its season of very major metabolic activity as a Mediterranean environment and a Mediterranean species, although be it, right, we understand that redwoods are on the northern kind of cusp of Mediterranean in the California sense, right? This is the time of year to start moving into this work on this species, okay? If you guys have questions about this, last week's stream talks all about how we prune redwoods, why we prune redwoods, and when we prune redwoods. It'll be your entry point into how to handle this species effectively, okay? That's all I wanted to say about that. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to slide this little guy over to think that I hauled this all the way here just to say that.
That tree turned out good.
Yeah, it did turn out good. Okay. Here we go. Deciduous trees. That was really dramatic. Okay, so one of the things that we've talked about, right? We've got this fall color change. We know that the change of pigmentation, we're seeing reabsorption of a lot of the chlorophyll and the resources that are present in these leaves, which is what shows us the change from green to yellow, red, orange, brown, etc., right? This is an opportunity for a lot of deciduous species to be doing fine pruning. Now, what is the one deciduous tree that we know, above all else, fall is the best time to be pruning it? Japanese maples. Japanese maples. And why is fall the best time to be pruning a Japanese maple? Because they bleed to death in the spring, absolutely, right? We prune them in the spring, we see them bleeding water, and we're saying, oh, that can't be good. Why? What's happening there, right? And we know that concentration of sugars and starches in that vascular tissue, all of a sudden when the water starts moving to even out that concentration gradient, triggered by temperature and daylight length, we're literally bleeding out all of the stored resources by pruning them in the spring. So because we also have established, and let me come back to this, okay, we've got this, and we've got our deciduous arc right there, we know that this is going to continue to load all of the resources it's pulling back in here, which is why we can come back in here and we can start pruning a lot of these really strong tips back to some of these interior pieces to start seeking out refinement without causing overly bleeding wounds. And we're transitioning energy from that very, very strong auxin-filled apical tip back into interior buds and still allowing them to do a little bit of metabolism and set up for next spring's spring push of foliage mass, okay? So this tree was actually a stream subject as well. This was, do we know what one this was?
Spring water.
Spring watering, okay? And we utilized that opportunity to discuss how we air layer trees in the spring watering stream because nobody wants to listen to us talk about water for 2 hours, right? But in doing so, right, the air layering of this tree, and again, another one of these really big questions that we get is, do we have to protect air layers over the winter season, right? And when is the best time to separate air layers? And so I thought, what better way to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, actually 3 at this point in time, by showing how we can come back in and prune at this point in time after seeing that we still have metabolism taking place once this tree enters dormancy and loses its leaves, right? How do we handle the air layer over the winter season? And then when is the best time to separate that air layer? This is what I want to talk about. Sounds like we have a question.
So what's driving that metabolism now that you're cutting off all those buds and it's losing its leaves?
Sure. So it's redistribution, right? So when we start to talk about on a cellular level, the way that plants move, they function far more slowly than we do as well, I mean, not necessarily, but we're driven, we control our temperature and the way we interact. Now, if we didn't have control of our temperature, we would function more slowly when it gets cold, right? So if you talk about cell to cell, and we've got this vacuole that's filled with water, and we've got this vacuole that's filled with water, and say, for example, we have this much sugar in this one. And say, for example, we have this much sugar in this one. And say, for example, we've got one more with this water, and we've got this much sugar in that one. Well, naturally, right? Naturally, and let me naturally, when we start to talk about, and potentially this is where maybe our leaf is right here, right? So this one has all this sugar. We're going to see the distribution of sugar, and we're also going to see the distribution of water changing until the amount of sugar present in all 3 of these cells is equivalent. Okay? This is osmotic movement or movement across a concentration gradient, and this is how plants function to make sure that the entirety of the plant has resources, has winter tolerance, and has the ability to store as much as it possibly can. Okay? So when we start to see this, Scott, when we change color from this leaf, all of the magnesium, all of the nitrogen, all of the iron, everything that creates chlorophyll and gives it its green color, it's not wasted. It's reabsorbed and pulled back into the tree and stored in the vacuole with that water, okay? But this one nearest, this very fine branch twig, nearest where that leaf was, has a tremendous amount of stored resources. But that tree, just in a day or two, can't distribute that across the millions and millions of cells that exist in this tree. So as it loses that color and these start to abscess or fall off, this distribution is taking place consistently while we're in that daylight period of time, and it's distributing, but that takes several weeks. And so we see the content and the cold hardiness increase over that first 4 to 6 weeks once we lose our leaves. Opportunity for us to be performing work on deciduous trees. Does that make sense? Okay?
Question.
So when I come back to this is the last time I'm moving it, P.S. Okay? When I come back to this, I'm making aesthetic as well as horticultural decisions, okay? I want to be taking the biggest, strongest pieces back to 2 internodes. Now, why do I want to take it back to 2 internodes? Why wouldn't I take it back to 1 internode? Bifurcation, exactly. So if I have 1 elongating shoot and I take it back to 1 bud, then I get 1 elongating shoot and I take it back to 1 bud. I never get a multiplication of my ramification, okay? When would I sacrifice bifurcation and cut back to a single bud? Okay, potentially strength, potentially direction. That's a great one, right? Strength, direction. Or Internode is too long for that portion of the tree, and I need to get tighter ramification or branch development to proportionally build my structure upon. Okay, so these are the reasons we would sacrifice. We have to understand, though, cutting back to 2 is how we get expansion of the physical branch structure of this tree. So each one of these, if I'm cutting back to 1, I'm cutting back to 1 because the internode length between the first and second bud is so long. For example, with this one here, right? I'm just going to show Ricardo on the stream here. I don't like how long that internode is right there. So I'm going to cut back to 1, okay? When you guys are looking out there, notice how long this internode is between those and how tight this one is. I'm good leaving 2 with that tight one, and I'm good getting rid of that long one. This is dictating my decision of where I prune, how I prune, and why I'm pruning. You guys got it? Okay.
Jacob has a question.
Jacob?
On the chat.
On the stream.
On the
Jacob,
stream.
talk to me.
Online.
Okay.
Jacob's wondering
We'll come back. We'll come back to you.
if it's better to cut all of the brown leaves off a tree, a deciduous tree like this now, or just to leave them till spring, if they serve any purpose.
No, it doesn't matter. So if you're talking about a beech, right, the Fagus species in particular, going ahead and cutting those off, totally acceptable.
Okay, how large of a branch are you capable of cutting this time of year?
Sure.
Does it vary by species?
Sure.
Too? I mean,
Sure.
including a trunk chop. I mean, really.
Yeah,
big?
great question. So I think it more hinges on what are we trying to accomplish via the cut, right? Because if we're saying, listen, I know if I cut this in the spring, I'm going to get massive bleeding and this is going to be a big wound, and I don't want that bleeding to occur, now would be a great time to cut, okay, for a Japanese maple, right? But the other time that we can prune Japanese maple is after they've pushed out that big first flush, reaccumulated their energy, we can go back in and make big cuts then because all that water has already been distributed and they bleed far less, say in that late spring, early summer period of time, and they've got stored energy to produce another flush of growth, right? But if we're saying, I don't want necessarily the response to be all of this prolific budding along the trunk, I'm not cutting down to a stump and regrowing all the branches, I'm just removing a branch, this is a great time to just remove a branch and not expect a response, okay? Yep. That whole idea of what are we trying to accomplish, for me has been a game changer as a bonsai practitioner because, you know, in Japan, when you're taught to do this, and you're also taught that you don't ask why, right? That's disrespectful to ask why. Why would I do this then? What? Like, what, you don't think you should do it then? Well, you can, you know, you don't need to be here, was basically kind of the gist of how things worked out as an apprentice. But, you know, understanding that why, I think, is one of the mechanisms that maybe potentially has been lost in Japan a little bit, right? Because of the inability to ask that question and understand the horticultural sense around it. And so that becomes a really interesting piece, okay? I want to come back to the root system. George, can we? So do these need to be protected? This being an air layer, these being, yeah? 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 You think so? Has anybody ever done an air layer? Successful air layer. Successful air layer. Yeah, right. I mean, it's good. Trying is great, right? Trying is great. Okay, have you ever done a successful air layer that you've left outside over the winter? Did it die? 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 Did anybody's air layer that they left outside over the winter die? Al, we got one in the back. Al, I'm sorry, man. All by yourself on that one, right? The answer is no. The answer is no. Now, could you kill it? Could you put it in such extreme conditions that there's nothing that could possibly survive? Yes, right? Typically, though, the roots that are produced via an air layer over the course of the wintertime do not die. Now, we've already said that the root system is the most susceptible organism, the most sensitive organism to cold. Why, then, do the roots of an air layer not share the same susceptibility as the roots in this container? This is a very, very big question for you guys. Less stress, closest to the leaves. They tend to be thick. Absolutely, they tend to be. So this is, you guys are killing it. Killing it. Making me so proud, my BSOP crew. Okay, So we're saying, listen, I've got this tree here. I'm going to air layer it right here, okay? And I've got this whole other system, whatever exists below this. I've got this whole other system, this trunk that also has all of these cells that are next to each other that are distributing all of these sugars and starches across this major vascular network, okay? Now, they all have the same leaves producing the same amount of photosynthetic resources that are being stored in these organs. But you're decreasing the tissue. You're decreasing the number of cells that the sugars and starches that would be distributed across this, but are now only being distributed across this, are being stored in. You have a higher concentration of sugars and starches in an air-layered root system for that first season, right? And this is a time-specific thing. For that first season, you have a higher concentration, which makes them more cold tolerant, which is why we don't necessarily, right, outside of the extremes of maybe Michigan and negative 20 degrees or something, we don't necessarily need to protect that. We can allow that to exist outdoors. I've yet to lose an air layer in 7 years as a bonsai professional to cold. I've yet to lose one to cold, okay? Because of that mechanism, it's a beautiful, wonderful animal, okay? Is there another question somewhere? Yes.
If you do a cut on a branch now, as opposed to one in the spring when it's growing, isn't the one in the spring more likely to grow faster and be more coarse and larger scar tissue?
Potentially, but let's just talk about that for a minute. So does the pruning decision that I make now impact what kind of tissue is formed next year? Or is the tissue that forms next year a direct product of the foliar mass that's creating that tissue? Because technically right now, all the sugars and starches are already captured, right? That's why these are falling off. The tree says, I've got it, right? So if I prune this now, at that point, or anywhere along this branch where I've pruned, does this produce tissue more or less rapidly next season hinges on how much stored energy is here that creates the foliar mass that then feeds that tissue production. Now, there is something happening here that you guys should notice, and that is every time I do this, there is less tissue, fewer buds, less vegetative components to distribute all the stored energy across. And that's going to activate all of the interior pieces of growth that otherwise would not be activated if you didn't prune, right? And so this does create more of an ability to create ramification, more of an ability to create interior budding, more of an ability to potentially distribute the energy across all of that adventitious growth. Yes? No? You good?
Yeah, basically, you're decreasing the auxin by taking the tips out.
Decreasing the auxin. Exactly. I mean, essentially, yeah, absolutely. Way to sum it up so elegantly for me, Roger. Love it. Love it. Okay. We good here? Oh, what do you got, Ron?
With deciduous trees like this,
speak into the mic.
Should you wait till the leaves drop or are dropping before you start any of this type of work?
Yeah, good question. Should we wait till the leaves drop or are dropping to start this work? I think the key to this, the key to success, waiting until the majority of the color change has taken place, right? Because that color change is reabsorption of all of the pigments and the resources that create the chlorophyll and the photosynthetic body of that. Those are valuable to the tree. Once that has changed, this color is remnants, right? So once you see that color change happen and it's starting to get towards the tail end, it's okay to come in and prune, remove those leaves, and do all of the maintenance work that you need to do, right? But that color change, that's the valuable point in the fall for deciduous pieces.
Paul wanted to know where the chlorophyll gets reabsorbed to.
Maybe a conversation for another time.
Go deep.
That'd be going. We can do that one night, Paul. Okay, we're good? You guys? You got it? Oh, wait, one more.
In the background, maybe you could say a little bit about watering during this period, and particularly the plants that are going indoors, greenhouse-wise, or cold storage.
Sure, watering in this time period. Yeah, and I said this, there was a question while we were at break, and I said one of the entry points for Phytophthora over the winter season. For us here, if the trees are outside, we can see anaerobic activity create an entry point. But one of the things that happens in greenhouses that we don't realize is a lot of times we underwater trees in greenhouses because the temperature is being kept at a point that's metabolizing root growth, but we can't see that, right? And so those roots are growing, they're consuming water. And this was catalyzed for me. I started my apprenticeship in August. By December, I was watering the greenhouse that held all of the kokufu trees for Mr. Kimura, right? And he said every day, right, the temperature stays at about, at that point, 45 degrees Fahrenheit, we'll just say, okay? Water these trees every day. Well, every day that I looked at them, the surface of the tree was completely wet. And I said, well, why would I'm going to get root rot, because I'm thinking root rot, right? Coming from the United States, like every book is like root rot, root rot, root rot. We keep our trees very dry because of that, disease that we've all been passed mentally. It was like inception, like you're going to have root rot, and so we don't water. So I'm holding back on water, holding back on water. Well, we repot all of the trees into their show containers, right? There's all 50, 70, 80, 100 trees, however many he's entering that year. And we start pulling them out, and I kid you not, there was dust in the air, just poof, as we were pulling them out, because the roots, the container was so dry, because it was being kept at 45 degrees. You had the sun also playing a factor in that, and these trees were continuing to grow, but they were growing in the root system because the daylight length was short, right? And so they were consuming water, and we pulled them out, and he had an absolute conniption. He's like, we're going to lose every single kokufu tree in this greenhouse. You've killed them. What have I done? I've left some, crazy foreigner in charge of all of my watering, and now I'm destitute as a professional. It was like one of the worst days of my life as an apprentice, right? There were multiple days like that, but that was one of them. And so that helped me understand. And so when we see Phytophthora in greenhouse cultivation, a lot of times it's because we kept the tree too dry over the winter, right? So being aware that 42 degrees and above catalyzes growth, particularly in the root system, and that doesn't reflect itself in the foliar mass. We need to continue to look and monitor that soil moisture level over the winter season to be able to stay ahead of that when we're overwintering our trees in a protected environment, okay? And I think that's important.
Carrie wants to know how long after leaf drop, after leaf drop do you have to prune before bleeding is a problem?
So you have the maximum amount of resources moving as the leaves are dropping and within that first sort of 2 to 4 week window. The earlier you do it, the better the compartmentalization of that wound. The later you do it, the more opportunity you open up for embolisms and atrophy of that wound. So I would say earlier is better than later, which is a lot of times why in Japan you'll see them stripping all of the leaves at the tail end of their fall color. They don't wait for them to fall. They pull them off, they prune, and then they put their trees into winter storage.
And then last question on this hornbeam. So the pruning you're doing now, are you going to need to do that again when the buds are emerging during spring?
No. What I do now should take care of it. When it comes springtime, I won't be touching this tree. Ponderosa pines, my favorite, right? Now, one of the things, we did a stream about how we prune ponderosa pines 3 or 4 weeks ago. Okay, if you guys are interested in that at all, please go back to that. Now, what we've established tonight, we shouldn't be heavily reducing the foliage mass, but this time of year is an opportunity, and this is one of the things I'm ending with this tree, because I want to take away all of the potential fear and apprehension that I've just put into you guys. Like, oh my gosh, your tree's going to die, it's going to freeze to death, it's going to, okay. There is a reasonable amount of work that trees can handle at this time of the year. Okay, so to come in, to clean out all of these old needles, get these out of there so that over the course of winter, and this has been mentioned several times, air movement, ventilation, airflow, potential too much humidity, too much moisture, etc. One of the ways that we help a tree be able to weather really wet conditions is by increasing the movement of air. And we always say oxygen. If we're talking about the roots, then all of a sudden oxygen is imperative. If we're talking about the foliage mass, what is imperative in the foliage mass to increase the movement of? Carbon dioxide, beautiful, right? The building block, carbon source for our C6H12O6 glucose, which is the sugar that drives growth, okay? But at the same time, as I'm cleaning these out, we have to give ourselves a little bit of reward. We've got to throw ourselves a bone that allow us to enjoy our trees. And this is where we can come in and we can do this cleanup of these needles growing on the bottom sides of our buds, okay? And just create that delineation between the pads. Now this has several different functions and purposes, and I want to be sure that we understand that this is a luxury afforded to healthy trees and healthy trees alone. If we have a sick tree, do we remove foliage mass? No. Absolutely not, okay? But when we have a healthy tree, and you're talking about photosynthetic efficiency of this foliage mass, right? The needles that are growing on the bottom of this foliage mass, are they getting as much light as the needles on the top? No, absolutely not, right? And we're saying this tree has a very dense, robust canopy. Is it capable or possible of sparing this photosynthetic mass that might not be efficiently producing sugars and carbohydrates, or sugars and starches? Is that possible? Yeah. Is it possible without sacrificing cold tolerance? No. Maybe not, but to what degree, right? And this is where we have to throw ourselves a bone and say, you know what? I'm pretty confident that I can clean this tree up, leave a majority of the foliage mass intact, and still have a bonsai that's capable of existing in the exterior environment with full cold tolerance intact. And this is where I'm giving you guys permission to relax a little bit. We've all talked about how scared we are, right? We've all shared our feelings this evening. Now we get to come back and we actually get to enjoy bonsai. So this is one of the very best times a year for ponderosa pines, because this is when this big shaggy mess that we have to leave to get these really nice, beautiful short needles, right? This is a wonderful needle size for a ponderosa pine, right? That's a very short needle for a ponderosa. This is the time of year where we get to enjoy them from the fall through the winter season, okay? And coming back and just using that aesthetic understanding that we need to delineate our foliage mass from one foliar plane to another, and the way that we do that is cleaning up the bottom of the branch line, not the top of the branch line, not the side of the branch line, cleaning up that bottom of the branch line so that we still present this beautiful bud intact, right? When we talk about pines, pines have a 360-degree needle distribution around the bud, all right? But when we take these off the bottom and we take some of these around the sides that are kind of crossing and clogging up our aesthetic, we get this really beautiful, wonderful presentation of these needles, and this is what maximizes the aesthetic of pines. This is when we really get to see them shine. So you guys, when we get into, let's see, we're in October now. So when we meet again, do we have a November meeting, Lime?
Yes.
When we meet again in November, we're going to be focusing almost entirely on black pine, on multi-flush pine, okay? And that's going to be a really interesting stream, because I'm going to carry you guys through how we handle multi-flush pines in depth. But this is the time for our single flush long needle pines to get to clean these up and see how beautiful that starts to become, that presentation, and all of a sudden we have this cleanliness, the way that bud is represented in the aesthetic of the tree. And if we start to look foliar mass to foliar mass, for example, you guys are looking through here and you notice these needles. You can see these, right? You can see these kind of crossing that presentation. I'm going to come back here, and as I clean up layer after layer, all of a sudden, all of our needles that are crossing like this, when they start to be presented like this, you get to pull on that beautiful aesthetic, and that's really what we're after. Okay, so I wanted to leave you guys off. We can prune our redwoods. We can prune our deciduous trees. We can clean up our single flush, long needle pines, short needle pines. Now is a great season to be doing that within reason, not impacting the health of the tree, not impacting the cold tolerance, and giving ourselves the ability to really max out that aesthetic that makes these species so appreciable as bonsai. Okay, take a look at that. Yeah? Beautiful, right? Beautiful. This is, you know, when I started my apprenticeship with Mr. Kimura, there were two things that happened my very first day as an apprentice. Number one, he came out of the house. I said good morning to him. He didn't acknowledge me. He started watering, right? And for 2 hours, he watered the whole garden, because all of his apprentices, except for me being new, were gone that day. It never happened again. I don't know why that day, but anyways, serendipity is serendipity, right? The second thing after he was done watering that he did is he pulled in a Japanese white pine. He showed me how to clean the needles off of the bottom of the tree. And he said, this is one of the single most important things I'm ever going to show you. If you master this skill, you will be able to create beautiful bonsai, right? And still, to this day, I don't see instructors or practitioners focusing enough on what is the aesthetic around the presentation of these needles that allows our trees to show their best possible beauty, right? And that is the delineation of these pads, the presentation of that origin, that lack of crossing and unsightly areas to get this, right? If you guys master nothing else, you say, I don't like wire, I don't want to wire, I'm not really into pruning, blah, 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 blah. If you can clean, that singular technique will produce a better bonsai than any other singular technique, right? Just the ability to clean, okay? Any questions about that?
Yeah, Paul was wondering if you're trying to get back budding on ponderosas, would removing the bottom needles stop that or inhibit that?
At this point in time, you've stored all sugars and starches that those needles are going to give you. It's not going to impair that process, assuming we already have enough foliage mass to be driving that forward. Tree is sparse, we don't pluck a needle though, right? So it hinges on the tree having foliage mass to be able to remove foliage mass.
Ryan, should I quit feeding my ponderosas now?
So we are starting to enter that period in time. Now this week is a perfect example. We're going to be 60s, 70s, metabolic activity cranking back up. We're going to see our trees dry out after that prolonged period of rain. This is when it pays to have fertilizer on our trees, right? This is when it absolutely pays. Now, when we start dropping down into the 40s, we start seeing consistent rain without these sunny patches. That's when we probably not only want to stop fertilizing, but also remove fertilizer so that it doesn't break down and turn into a mucky mess on the surface of our container. And we're going to be getting there over the next, say, 3 to 4 weeks. We'll be in that zone, okay? So you probably, maybe, depending on how the weather looks, and we've got a pretty prolonged period of heat, right, and fall heat, okay? We actually have a window to maybe do one more light application if you do it tomorrow, one more light application to get some benefit from that. Yes. Can you ask that in the mic and we'll pass it back to you?
Should it be a low nitrogen fertilizer at this point?
Good question. So if we're feeding deciduous trees low nitrogen, for sure, because we would hate with a 70-degree, week and nitrogen being applied to the tree to catalyze or trigger any kind of redistribution of sugars and starches to the tip and potentially encourage budding to occur. And Japanese maples are notorious for this, right? So we lose all of that cold hardiness that we've gained. We get this flush, it's sensitive freeze, right? Conifers will be more selective about what they take in. Balanced feed on conifers in the fall, totally acceptable. Low nitrogen in late fall on deciduous, best way to go.
My question pertains to the watering in the winter. You said that the root growth happens. Am I wrong in thinking that a drier soil encourages more root growth, or does a wetter soil encourage root growth?
Balance of water and oxygen, right? Whether it's summer, winter, spring, or fall, balance of water and oxygen. And there is a thought process that has been put out into the world that the drier you keep your trees, the more the roots look for water. Nothing could be farther from the truth, right? Trees need water. Trees love water. They need a balance of water and oxygen to thrive. That's what we're always striving to achieve. Yeah, absolutely. So over the winter season, not wet, not dry. We need that balance, okay? And then we're always striving for that. Yes?
Brian, quick question. I made a really nice cold frame for my trees last winter using straw.
Cool.
Which I removed in the summer and planted some Swiss chard.
Oh, good.
I got leaf miners.
Uh-huh.
So I'm wondering, I know they're nasty, they get in everything. Can I put straw back in there and use that same area, or will the leaf miners get in my trees?
Did you remove the chard?
Yes, and the spinach.
That's tough because a lot of times insects will overwinter in the soil or on the structures or on the surrounding environment. And so there would be a question of whether or not the food source of your trees, whether that meets the leaf miner's palate or not, right? But typically if you remove that infected or highly tasty treat for an insect, you tend to not see that population proliferate as much. If you had any question about whether or not you had an issue, you could treat the area with a dormant spray before you put your trees in, and even treat your trees with a dormant spray, a dormant oil or a lime sulfur treatment. And that's exactly what it's designed to do, is to knock down overwintering eggs and overwintering fungal spores, okay?
JT wants to clarify if low nitrogen means 5 or below.
Well, so yeah, that's an interesting question because when we start feeding with organics, it's very tough to find an organic fertilizer with low nitrogen. So typically when you say low nitrogen, you would be saying virtually nitrogenless, right? Which I would say for an organic would be 1 or below. I would say for a chemical would be 0. Would be what I would be pushing for that. Now, I don't know if this is San Jose JT or not, but for you don't have as much of an issue with that where you're at. For colder winter areas where we run the risk of producing that growth, again, based on sort of erratic conditions, Colorado would be another place that you could really kind of shoot yourself in the foot with a high nitrogen feed or even a moderate nitrogen feed and warmer temperatures. You want to be careful with that. I would say kind of pulling back on nitrogen entirely on our deciduous trees in late fall, smartest thing we could do.
And then Paul wants to know if now is the best time to do a thread graft on a deciduous tree.
Worst time in the world. Worst time in the world. Gotta think bonsai. When would you guys do a thread graft? When it's growing. Just prior to growth, right? You got the buds almost starting to swell. If they swell too much, it's tough to get them through that thread graft, right? Just as the tree is waking up, thread graft, tissue is active, resources are moving. That's when we get meshing of cambial layers. Thinking bonsai. Yeah.
As far as thread grafting goes on a Japanese maple, would you want to wait until after that first flush goes out so that you're not drilling a hole and letting it bleed to death?
That is amazing, right? Absolutely. So you let that first flush open out, harden off. You energy positive. We can defoliate the thread grafting branch, drill it, thread it, allow it to refoliate, right? And not allow the tree to bleed too much. Very good. Yep. I like it. I like the gears turning. I see it happening. We good, guys? I speak for myself and the team, everybody online. We appreciate you guys tuning in. BSOP, we love you guys. We're so proud of you and so honored to be a part of this with you guys and the growth of our bonsai practice. Thank you very much. We'll see you next month. Have a wonderful bonsai autumn and wish you guys all the best over Halloween.